Okay, so you described yourself, Stephanie, as Jenny Murray from Outlander. Is that the books or the movies, the series? Which is more accurate and why?
Oh, that's tough.
Or actually, I should say, why are you Jenny, and why do you describe that way?
I think she's passionate. She's fierce. She loves her children. She's got a big family. I would love to say that I'm Claire, really, but I'm not. And so when asked the question, who do I identify with? Jenny Murray came to mind. I'm reading the latest book in the series. I watched the series, and like I said, I would have loved to have said Claire, but Jenny was just a more realistic option.
Now, partly for myself, I've only seen the series once, and it's been a while. I am struggling to remember her character. Can you re-describe for those who have not yet read Outlander or enjoyed the show?
Sure.
It does have an MA warning, so.
Right. And
Who's Jenny again? She was the sister, right?
She is the sister of Jamie Fraser. And let me say that the books are not anywhere near as rated R as the show is. So, and they get less rated R as the series progresses, thank God, because those are portions that I just skip over. But Jenny is Jamie's sister, so the sister of the main character, and Jamie saves her from a situation where she's being abused by British soldiers, and she's forever grateful to him. She's fiercely loyal to him, to her husband, who happens to be disabled. I have a disabled husband, so maybe that's part of it. She does have a lot of kids. Loves them deeply. She's not a major character, so she's not as well developed, certainly, as the Claire and Jamie Frasers of the world. But I don't watch a lot of television. I don't watch a lot of movies, and frankly, these days I don't read a lot because I do have 5 children and a disabled husband. But that's one of my favorite series, so I had to pick a character from that.
Well, that's awesome. I remember watching that, and what was the name of the place where they live? Where she lives. It's got a distinct name.
Castleiac? Well, Lollybrock.
There we go, Lollybrock. And watching that, that felt so real, and I think my wife and I had been watching at the same time Escape to the Chateau, which is a series that's just rocked the British world. But anyhow, that sort of return to rediscovering those quiet, beautiful old places and so on. So, all right, why don't we dive into the show? Hey everyone, Dominic here with Catholic Author. It's the show about fiction for modern Catholic authors. Today we're joined by Stephanie Engelman. Welcome, Stephanie. It's good to have you.
Thank you. It's great to be on the show.
Alrighty, for the show, the way that it works is we talk creed, craft, and co-creation rooted in grit, grace, gods, and dragons when we can squeeze them in. I'm your host, Dominic, a novel lover, all-around creative, founder of Catholic Author. We're here to inspire your faith and your fiction. Stephanie, as she's just described, she's a wife, a mother, she's a podcaster. She's the author of A Single Bead, a Catholic young adult novel about the power of the Rosary. So we're going to chat all about that. Before we get into that, your story, Stephanie, and the inspiration for that, what is your origin story, and how did you get to where you are now, such that you're writing this young adult novel?
Well, I really was a lukewarm Methodist growing up, and God played a very small role in my life. I actually went through a period of atheism, and it was not until I was 29. My sister had tried to convert me several years before to the Catholic faith. I promptly told her that she was insane, agreed to read the books that she sent me, and was converted in my mind, but not in my heart. So I really remained churchless. For many years, I don't even know that I was going to church on Christmas and Easter. And then with time, I believe the Eucharist acted as a actual physical tug towards the Catholic Church. Every time I drove past the small Catholic church in my area, I actually felt a physical tug. And that led to my conversion, and really just a myriad of events conspired to just make me fall in love with the church and fall in love with God and Jesus Christ, and to really just be on fire with a desire to do my part to evangelize and to grow Christ's church and faith in Him. So I'm not a writer by any sort of training, really. I was a psychology major in college. It was a skill that I always, I knew I could write, but it was not the thing that I chose to. I didn't even consider focusing on it in school. When our third son was born premature, and I was actually on bed rest for several weeks in the hospital, my husband suggested that I should start keeping a blog. And I didn't even know what a blog was at the time, but he set me up with one, and I started writing about my experience of, being on bed rest and then the baby coming along and being in NICU for a long period of time. And that really became a Catholic blog about various matters of faith. And so I began to identify as a little bit of a writer. And meanwhile, at the same time I'm doing Bible studies, I'm learning everything I can about the church and scripture and just in everything that I was doing. Well, I wish I could say it was in everything, but I was trying in everything that I was doing to deepen my relationship with Christ.
Was there a particular thing that just intrigued you, or, what was it that kept pulling you along with that journey? Like you said, you're starting as the Methodist, and then the psychology background, and then going into atheism for a while, and then do you start to see a thread now looking back of an interest or something that, the line that God was pulling to kind of draw you in?
There are a lot of threads. Looking back, I remember having shopped at flea shops and picking up rosaries and hanging them on the wall above my bed, even though I was a Methodist and thought that Catholics were nuts. I mean, I really, truly, I used to say
why?
that
why
there
did you
were...
grab them?
Because they were pretty. And by then I had identified, I came out of atheism with a stronger faith. It did not mean a church faith. It meant I did believe that there was God, and I did try to talk with Him pretty regularly, which did not mean, again, it didn't mean that He was directing anything in my life. It just meant that I knew He was there. And so I began to want to have Christian symbolism in my life. And I did identify the rosary. I didn't know what a rosary was, really. It was a pretty piece of jewelry that I hung above my bed. But I think that's really interesting, because then obviously I began to identify very, very strongly with the rosary. And that came about, really, if anything, the rosary is what was stringing me along. When I was pregnant with that third child that I had prematurely, I was a relatively new Catholic. I hadn't prayed the rosary a lot. And I had an argument with an extended family member who was visiting and staying at our home. And I was just completely bent out of shape, very, very angry, very, I had been wronged. This was an unjust situation. And I was on my way to a doctor's appointment, and I started to pray a rosary. And it was more like, well, this is what Catholics do, and they say that it's going to make me feel better, so I'm going to do it. And it was Saturday, so I was praying the joyful mysteries. And once I got to the doctor's office, I had begun to feel this change within myself, this shift. I just felt so much more peaceful over the whole situation. And then I continued to finish praying that rosary on my way home. And by the time I reached my home, I was ready to make amends with this family member. I was ready to apologize. I could recognize where I had done something wrong in the situation. And I was ready to just be a whole lot more forgiving and cool, calm, and collected in the days going forward that they were still going to be, staying at our home. And after that, I got hooked, and it was literally not even a month later that I had to go on bed rest with my son. And so I'm praying it every day, and I'm praying for, him to just stay in for one more day. That's my water broke at 30 weeks gestation. So then the doctor said, you're probably going to have this baby in 24 hours, if not 24 hours, probably 48 hours. But every day we can get is great. So I was just constantly praying one more day, one more day, one more day. And he defied the odds, and he stayed in for 3 weeks. And I really felt like my prayer and the prayer of so many people around us had a lot to do with that. And when he was born, he was significantly bigger than they expected him to be. They had they thought he would be about 4 pounds. He was 4 pounds 12 ounces, which is very, very significant. Beautiful. And largely healthy. But he ended up having to be in the hospital for 7 weeks. And so then I prayed the rosary every day at his bedside. And after that, I was just completely hooked. There was no going back. And I've pretty much prayed the rosary once a day, if not, all 15 or 20 decades once a day for, his entire life. He's 14 now. So, wow. So that was my string. It was Our Lady. She was pulling me along.
I think that's beautiful. All right, let's talk about the novel here. So here's the blurb that you got for A Single Bead. And now that you've shared some of that backstory, some of this starts to open up a little bit and makes sense why you would write this. So here's the blurb. When Caitlin finds a bead from her grandmother's rosary, she quickly learns others have found beads as well, and these people have had mystical experiences which appear to be connected with beads. Determined to find more of the missing rosary, the teenage girl finds herself on a journey of faith awakened by prayer. I would kind of want to ask, what was the origin or the inspiration for this story, but you've kind of, started sharing that, but could I ask you to keep going then? So what inspired you to then start telling this story and create this character? And what inspired you to create that?
Well, my story is a little unusual, but I wanted to write a Bible study on the rosary because this was 2013, and there weren't a lot of Catholic Bible studies. We've actually gotten a lot more since then, and I saw that as a great need within our church. And so I was looking around at, what publishers were looking for, what the manuscript submission guidelines were. And I stopped on one particular publisher, Pauline Books and Media, and as I was reading their manuscript submission guidelines, it said, we are specifically seeking young adult Catholic fiction. And you know how God speaks to you sometimes. And those words, it was like they were in neon. Like there was something about those words that I knew, you're supposed to pay attention to this, Stephanie. And I literally laughed out loud, and I said out loud, God, if you want me to write young adult Catholic fiction, you're going to have to give me the idea because I've got nothing. It was absolutely not my plan. Okay. I frankly thought fiction, I wouldn't have said this, but fiction seemed more frivolous than a Bible study. And so I had actually just consecrated myself to Our Lady for the first time. It was shortly after October 7th. That's when I consecrated. And someone tweeted to me one morning. My Twitter handle was at a single, or it was a few beads short, because I'm a few beads short of a full rosary. Like some people are a few fries short of a Happy Meal. So they tweeted to me, at a few beads short, but have you ever thought of the power of a single bead? And I tweeted back, oh, that's a great point. I'll have to write a blog post about that. And then a few hours later, I'm driving along after my family had gone to see a movie, and I literally got the first chapter of A Single Bead in a download. And just it was absolutely, the Holy Spirit just gave me a download of the first chapter. I knew that there was a teenage girl, that her grandmother died a year before in a plane crash. They went to the site of the plane crash for a little private memorial. She finds a bead from the grandmother's rosary. It's not just any bead. It's her bead that has her initials, because the rosary was personalized with the initials of all the grandchildren. And then she goes on to find out that there are other beads, and to go on a search for more beads. I didn't know what the conflict was going to be, and I knew enough about fiction to know that I had to have some sort of a conflict. But I knew that was the beginning of the story. And that very same day, I turned to my husband. It was October. I knew that NaNoWriMo was a thing from a fiction author friend. And I told my husband, I think God is calling me to write a novel in the month of November. Can you help me? Can you watch the kids? Can you That's support awesome. Me? And he did. And I wrote the first 50,000 words of A Single Bead in the month of November.
Talk about from 0 to 100 in just a drive. That's incredible. So, My goodness, too many questions now. So, all right, let me see if I can pick one. When you describe them having mystical experiences, is the story, how do I say this? Is it like magical realism where it's grounded in the real world, but it feels a little bit like a fantasy fiction version of Christianity, or does it stay quite grounded in very direct real experiences? It's not kind of a fantasy thing. It's like a modern contemporary fiction story.
It stays very real, and all of the miracles and mystical experiences that are in the book, I have some personal knowledge of. Some of it's just I heard a story that this happened. But one story in particular, there's a story of a man who was a drug addict. He's a recovered drug addict. And the Blessed Mother appeared to him when he was coming out of a high and he was at a low. He was homeless. And she appeared to him and told him to clean up his act. And he did. He went, to the local, basically the Salvation Army, although I don't name it as such. And he gets his act cleaned up, and then he goes on to run the drug rehabilitation center that had helped him. And that is the true story. That's 100% the true story of the father of a friend of mine who was coming down from a high off of heroin when he saw an apparition of the Blessed Mother, and she told him to get his act together. I mean, it's 100% Beautiful. That story. Slightly different character. But, people are rescued from car accidents and things like that. These things really do happen. And that was one thing that in retrospect, honestly, as I was writing A Single Bead, I wasn't very mindful about it. I was just kind of relying a lot on the Holy Spirit to provide him for inspiration. I would write a chapter one day and finish it, and I would have no idea what the next chapter was going to be. And, I'd go to bed and sleep on it. And then the next day, there's the next chapter. There's the next 2,000 words. So
just talk about, diving into the deep end. I mean, I imagine most people going into NaNoWriMo have a sense of where the story is going to end up. So you literally wrote each day through the process.
I had no idea what the conclusion was. I didn't know what the conflict was. Like I said, I did not know until I was writing it. And as I wrote the first chapter...
Okay.
As I wrote the first chapter, I wrote the mom mean. I wrote the mom very obviously struggling and being unkind to the main character, Caitlin. And that ended up being that she was experiencing depression and a lot of guilt and just really struggling herself. And she was taking it out on her teenage daughter. As so often we take it out on the people closest to us. And I know, how sad to take it out on your daughter, but that ended up being the conflict that Caitlin, the main character, has this terrible relationship with her mom because her mom is suffering from the depression, and mom ends up having to go in and get help. And Caitlin, then her ultimate goal is to find the bead that will help her mom. She wants to find her mom's bead with her mom's initials, hoping that will be the magic. And she really is kind of looking for a magic, but instead she finds the power of prayer.
Beautiful. Okay, so let's talk about the process then for you a little bit. So you went through NaNoWriMo and you got to the end and you had yourself a working first draft. Then what was the process like? I mean, first of all, what was the experience like for you doing that with NaNoWriMo? Did you get to the 15-day mark and just you're ready to throw in the towel, the 20-day mark, and light at the end of the tunnel? Was it frustrating? What was that experience for you?
Well, first, let me say, I have tried to do NaNoWriMo since, and I have not succeeded. So I think my NaNoWriMo, my whole writing experience, I've written other books since, and I know it is not normally this difficult, this easy. Sorry, it's much more difficult than what writing A Single Bead was. A Single Bead just feels like a gift to me. And sometimes we have to work a lot harder for something really beautiful. So to any writers out there that are not experiencing this is it. My experience is very weird and not to be taken for granted and not to be expected. So For me, I mean, I really did. It was pretty easy that time around. And God bless my husband because he did watch my kids. He was very patient. I found that I wrote really well in a crowded environment. So very often I would leave and do a lot of my writing on Saturday and Sunday when I could go, I could leave the house and leave the kids with my husband and write at Starbucks. And, they give you that nice little chart that you're graphing how you're coming along. And I just tried to stay really close to where my graph needed to be. I had a lot of friends praying for me. I had friends that even brought me meals and, did little things to help out because they knew that I was going for a goal. I was going for a big goal. And, that one time hasn't worked out that well since, but that one time NaNoWriMo was really easy.
Nice. So then what was the revision process like? Was that relatively easy as well, or was that more intense in working with the publisher? Did they make you make changes or alter the plot structure in any way? What was that like?
Well, first of all, I should say I did not finish the whole book in November. It's only the first 50,000 words that you have to finish to win, quote unquote, NaNoWriMo. Okay. So I did 50,000 words. I was right there. And then I finished the whole novel the day after Christmas, which happens to be my birthday, which oddly happens to be the feast of St. Stephen, which I was not raised Catholic, and yet my parents named me Stephanie on the feast of St. Stephen, which I think is really interesting. And so that's the day that I finished. And the revision process, again, it's so not the normal writing process. I have done revisions since. I have written books and rewritten books and rewritten books. And A Single Bead needed relatively minor edits from the very beginning. I know I sent it to my sister. I only had, I think, 2 beta readers. I didn't even know what a beta reader was. So I sent it to 2 people to just make sure that it wasn't awful. Mm-hmm. And my sister put it off because she didn't want to have to tell me. Like, she put off reading it because she didn't want to have to tell me that it was awful, and she was pretty sure that it would be.
Okay.
And finally, when she went on spring break, she was like, "Okay, I'm going to read it, and I'll just deal with whatever I have to tell Stephanie." And she called me when she was on spring break, and she was in tears, and she said, "I can't believe this is so good." And that was so that's spring break. That's March, and I had just finished the book in December, at the end of December. So I had relatively few edits, and then I submitted it to Pauline, and I submitted it to one contest that was only going to, publish one book. I did not win that contest, but Pauline Books and Media, which of course was the company that had originally set off those blinkers in my brain, they notified me on October 7th, the Feast of the Holy Rosary, and the 1-year consecration the 1-year anniversary of my consecration to Mary, that they wanted to extend a contract.
That's beautiful.
And then the editing process, Jamie Wolfe was my editor. She's fantastic. She was such a pleasure to work with. And Pauline in general, they were just so respectful of the artistic process. And there was very little that they demanded. I had not included a priest in the book, which is, I think, indicative of my non-Catholic background, that I even then was not completely comfortable with priests. And so they said, "Hey, you need to make somebody in the book a priest. You need to let some of the wisdom and advice that young Caitlin receives come from a priest." And so I made one of the characters, one of her uncles, as a priest, and he kind of stepped up, and I made him a little bit more of a figure. And then they, just some really minor things. It was really a very easy editing process. Some things that surprised me, like at one point I had one of the characters pointing up to refer to heaven. And they said, "Oh, no, you can't do that. You can't, heaven isn't necessarily up. So we're not going to point up," little things like that. But all in all, they made the comment that it was one of the cleanest manuscripts they had ever seen. And I think I'm a pretty clean writer, and I'm a perfectionist. But again, I think that part of it, I just have to give credit to Our Lady, who, of course, I had just consecrated to, and she was just taking advantage of that. Like, okay, you've given me everything, Stephanie. Here you go. Give me your fingertips on that keyboard. And I brought some of my own life into the story. The family is very much like my own. The grandparents are very much like my parents. Mm-hmm. But all in all, there was an awful lot of Holy Spirit involved in that book.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, first, for those who are watching, if you're enjoying this, please go ahead and hit that like button. It helps more people to hear about Stephanie, hear about her work. I think that let's also take this as a point of encouragement that it's not always going to be an impossibly difficult and arduous kind of thing. Sometimes, maybe if you've been gestating this story for a while and maybe it's not even been evident, sometimes all you need is just like this little domino to trigger an avalanche of just inspiration that all of a sudden collapses and folds together and just works. I've got a question. I want to come back. You had mentioned earlier, where was it again? You at the time had thought of fiction as a frivolous thing. I want to come back and ask you about that. But very briefly, this show, the Catholic Author Show, it's a kind of a preview of the community we're building in Catholic Author. It's the super friendly creative community for modern Catholic authors. It's a place to give and get feedback, share insights, works in progress, and build a network of supportive friends. Plus, there's a whole lot more going on all the time. So check us out and come and join us at CatholicAuthor.us. So have you revised your opinion now about fiction being not so frivolous maybe, or are you continuing to write other novels, or are they more nonfiction things?
I have absolutely revised my opinion. And, I heard the quote, and I'm not going to be able to tell you who said it, but he who controls the story controls the culture, controls the world, or something like that. And so I had to do a lot of introspection after God called me to write this fiction novel when I wanted to write a Bible study. And I realized, if I wrote a Bible study, I would kind of be preaching to the choir. The only people that go to Bible study are those people that are already believing, those people that are already trying to learn more about their faith. And with fiction, we have this opportunity to sneak into the lives of the unbeliever. And I don't mean that, I don't want to be manipulative, but we really do have this opportunity to begin to take our culture back. And so whether you're overtly writing about Catholicism, as A Single Bead very much is very overt Catholicism, or whether you're being more covert, and there's quite a bit of that out there. I have a graphic novel that will be coming out sometime in the next few months, and
cool.
It's the story of this, teenage boy, and the only mention of any religion is, when he goes on a starvation diet, and he talks about his brother points out that Jesus went for 40 days without food and water, and there's no overt Christianity in that book, and yet I hope that in some small way it changes the culture, just because it shows a big family, and it shows these little bits and pieces of Christianity that we just need to take back. We need to take back this culture that's become so twisted. And how many books can you pick up in the mainstream media anymore that don't have characters that completely flout the Catholic teachings, right? You've got all sorts of questionable, I don't want to get into politics or anything like that here, but all of the confusion that we have in our world today is so resident in our fiction, in our nonfiction, and certainly on the television and in the movies. And we as Catholics have a duty to take that back. And we can take it back with stronger, more clear, out loud messages, or we can do it in a quiet way and just say, no, there are still faith-filled families out there doing the right thing, living these lives quietly dedicated to Christ. And we can just portray those characters with a good storyline.
Absolutely. And I think that right there strikes the heart of what we're trying to do with Catholic Author, through conversations like these and through the community and the kind of people we're trying to help inspire, is that kind of insight. You can either be overt, in your fiction, or you can be imaginative in your fiction. And it just depends on your audience and who you want to reach. And some people, it's kind of like if we were to read a novel about a medieval Japanese samurai who's like completely dedicated to his life and what that's really like and so on. And we can sort of read that with a sense of interest, like an outsider looking at a museum or something, looking at somebody else's life from the outside. And sometimes it's really important to have these kinds of overt narratives like what you've created. And it allows people to kind of look over our shoulders at what life is like for us, even if they don't agree with it, but they can get on board with, it's a cool story. And then there's the other tack, which is just being more imaginative, grounding where a character goes and the ideas in the story, grounding them in how we see the world, even if it's never like, spelled out. And sometimes it doesn't always need to be. And that's kind of why, imaginative fiction really is has such a broad interest. I think it was Sister Nancy Usselman. She wrote a book that I'm still trying to get through because I keep making the mistake of putting it off, but she called it had to do with like what was it, mystics in literature or something. But she's passionate about this idea that fiction isn't necessarily, or modern mass media and so on, isn't necessarily leading us around by the nose. It's resonating with truths that are already inside us, truths that God doesn't let go of, that he keeps igniting, he keeps inspiring. And that's why we keep gravitating towards certain kinds of stories that inspire us. Maybe on a more natural law level. It's maybe not as explicit as what the Catechism might, elucidate for us. But stories grounded in a healthy natural law can be just as inspiring. And it's so much easier to also to share and, to talk about. Along those lines, I'm curious, how maybe in your thinking about it or you're revising, how did you tackle, I don't know what you want to call it, temptation maybe to be preachy with your story, your writing, and sort of not go there? And I confess I've totally done that with some of my own stuff, and I'll never share this, don't ask, but for those who are watching, but to actually move a story through what a character actually on their own terms, to earn an ending that makes sense within the context of the story. Any thoughts along those lines and how you tackled that?
Well, there were a lot of lessons learned for young Caitlin. She starts off the book as a person much like what I was before I joined the Catholic Church. She's very much lukewarm. She doesn't even, she believes in God, but, he's kind of just a go-to for when you're in trouble, maybe. Her dad doesn't believe at all. And her mom's away from the church. They don't go to Mass on Sunday. And then just very slowly over the course of the book, there's no one full scene that is probably really dedicated to teaching or preaching or anything like that. A lot of it is done through dialogue. She does learn a lot from her aunt and her uncle. She's got one faith-filled aunt, and then, of course, the uncle priest. But more of it's learned through her experiences and through, I wanted to, most importantly, again, to the degree that I went into this with any thoughts of my own or plans of my own, but I wanted to show the power of prayer. And to me, the power of prayer, well, you don't need to teach that. It's very much something that you can show. So over the course of the book, she repeatedly begins to experience peace in her own heart as she begins to participate in prayer. She's got a cousin who's a little bit more faithful than she is. And that cousin, along with the aunt, they're encouraging her to, hey, why don't you try praying the rosary? And after she prays it, then all of a sudden, she wants to find another bead. She desperately wants to find another bead. So the cousin says, well, hey, how about we pray the rosary? I don't have time to pray the rosary. Well, let's pray a speed rosary. So they pray a speed rosary over the phone. And lo and behold, 5 minutes later, the phone rings and somebody's found a bead. And that's a realistic experience. How many of us haven't had that experience where we've offered up some prayer and then we do have a miraculous answer? It's not anything that, is going to go down in the history books, but it's a big deal. It's enough to make us think, oh my goodness, I think that might have actually worked. And that's what it does for Caitlin, who totally doesn't really believe in the power of prayer. And then another thing happens, and another thing happens. And like just every time she prays the rosary, something good seems to happen. And that's what I want my readers to take away is something good happens every time we pray. It may be something tangible. It may be something intangible. Maybe you're not even going to know it. But over time, really amazing things happen with prayer. And so I guess that's why the book isn't preachy, because there's very little teaching. There are a few situations where, the Anne is explaining the role of the Blessed Mother, or, Caitlin herself has this one mystical experience while she's praying the sorrowful mysteries of the Rosary, and the aunt kind of explains that to her. But it's very limited. It really is. It's mostly shown through the events and the things that happen to Caitlin as she experiences the power of prayer in her own life.
Beautiful. Yeah, there's a section in Peter Kraft's book, and I think it's the book called, it's Doors in the Walls of the World, and one of his more recent books. And he speaks to something very similar to this, where he's like, we don't understand the power of simple prayers, the power of maybe a grandmother at the moment of her passing, breathing the Shema if she's Jewish. And if you were to dramatically imagine, the cosmos as like a tilting platter, on the scales of justice or something, that one little breath, well intended, in full gratitude or something, could that tip things over to the right? And it's not to inspire people to feel like, I've got to double down and now start, praying a ton more. It's like, no, I think it has a lot more to do with intention. Like you said, you can speed through a rosary and it can still, we can trust it can still work and be
right.
Efficacious,
I just told my daughter the other day, we had just received communion and I was kneeling next to her and I said, Jesus's favorite prayer is probably, I love you, Jesus. And I have, as I sit at my desk, I have a picture of Jesus and I have a picture of Mary on my wall, and I didn't cover them for Lent. I'm sorry for these last 2 weeks.
Yeah, me too.
But these are my two that they're pretty big images, and I look at them before me, and that's the first thing that comes to mind. And I do believe that that's one of Christ's favorite prayers is just, I love you, Jesus. We don't have to come up with amazing words. We just have to try to speak from our hearts. And, maybe it's, I want to love you, but I'm not feeling that love. Help me to love you. Whatever it is, every time we think of Christ, to just try to offer some word of love, some word of praise, it has to be such a balm for his Sacred Heart.
Yeah. We'll start to wrap up here, but I remember reading one line that I think Christ appeared to St. Catherine of Siena, and he said to her this one thing that just completely, I don't know, it's a seed that's been working on me for a while. But he said, I would recreate this entire creation, billions of years of change and whatever, and human history, I would do it all over again just to hear you say to me one more time, I love you.
Wow.
That just, I love that. In wrapping up, how can people get in touch with you, Stephanie?
Well, my website is stephanieengelman.com. Engelman is with an E-L, not an L-E. And my book is available at paulinebooksandmedia.com, as well as on Amazon and in your local Catholic bookstores. And feel free to find me on my website. I'm on Instagram and Facebook. So find me there.
Fantastic. And then it's my favorite part of every episode. If you had 1 minute to share a word of encouragement to other Catholic authors, either new voices or experienced, budding, or just thinking about getting into it all, what would you want to share with them?
Wow. I would say just give it everything you've got. Put your trust in God. Tell Jesus that you love him, and tell him that you trust in him to provide you with the inspiration and the grace to complete this work that he has put on your heart. And sometimes it is going to be work. It's not always going to come easily. But just forage through that. Keep on writing. Don't give up, even if it's just for 5 minutes a day. When it gets too hard, when the inspiration isn't coming, get away from it. I get some of my best inspiration when I'm out kayaking or mountain biking. When I'm just sitting at my desk, I tend to get a little dry. So get out into the world and experience life, experience God's beauty, and then allow that to flow through your soul and provide inspiration to the beautiful work that you're doing.